The courthouse buzzer echoed through the marble halls as Michael Thompson sat quietly on the wooden bench outside courtroom 4B. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees, showing no signs of the storm brewing inside his chest. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines that 25 years of military service had carved into his features. Michael had been many things in his life. A son who made his parents proud, a husband who loved deeply, a father who tried his best, a sailor who served with honor. But today, he was just another defendant in a civil lawsuit, wearing his only good suit and trying to understand why his world had fallen apart so completely. The case against him seemed simple enough on paper. His neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Williams, claimed that the large oak tree in his backyard had damaged her property during last winter's storm. She wanted $15,000 in damages and demanded that he remove the century-old tree that had stood long before either of their houses existed. What the paperwork didn't show was the real story. Mrs. Williams had moved in 2 years ago and immediately began complaining about everything Michael did. She called the police when he worked in his garage past 9 in the evening. She reported him to the Homeowners Association for having grass that was supposedly too long. She even complained to the city about the American flag he flew in his front yard, claiming it was too large and violated some obscure municipal code. Michael knew this lawsuit wasn't really about the tree. It was about her desire to push him out of the neighborhood he had called home for over a decade. Ever since his wife Sarah had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, Mrs. Williams seemed to view him as an easy target. She probably thought a grieving widower would be too broken to fight back. The truth was more complicated. Michael wasn't broken, but he was tired of fighting battles that seemed pointless, tired of explaining himself to people who had already made up their minds about him, tired of living in a world that felt increasingly foreign to someone who had spent most of his adult life following orders and serving something bigger than himself. He had tried to handle the situation quietly. When Mrs. Williams first complained about the tree, he had offered to trim any branches that hung over her property line. When she rejected that solution and demanded complete removal, he suggested they split the cost of a professional arborist's assessment. She refused that too. It became clear that nothing short of total capitulation would satisfy her. Michael's lawyer, a young public defender named James Martinez, had warned him that civil court could be unpredictable. The judge might not understand military culture, Martinez had said during their brief consultation. Try to speak up and explain your side clearly. Don't assume your service record will speak for itself. But speaking up had never been Michael's way. In the Navy, he had learned that actions mattered more than words. Results counted more than explanations. A job well done required no justification, and complaints were handled through proper channels with documented evidence and formal procedures. Civilian court, he was beginning to realize, operated by different rules. Here the loudest voice often won. The person who could craft the most compelling narrative, regardless of its relationship to facts, held the advantage. Mrs. Williams had certainly mastered this approach, painting herself as a victim of Michael's negligence and unreasonable behavior. The courtroom door opened and a bailiff called his name. Michael stood slowly, his knees protesting after too many years of military training and not enough years of proper rest. He walked into the courtroom with the same measured pace he had used to walk onto the deck of aircraft carriers in rough seas. Judge Harold Brennan looked up from his paperwork with obvious irritation. At 62, Brennan had developed a reputation for running his courtroom like a corporate boardroom, favoring efficiency over empathy. He had little patience for cases he considered trivial, and even less patience for people who wasted his time with what he saw as unnecessary drama. Mrs. Williams sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who had clearly done her homework. They had prepared charts, photographs, and expert testimony. Their presentation looked professional and thorough. Michael sat beside his overwhelmed public defender, who shuffled through a thin folder containing the basic facts of the case. The contrast between the two legal teams was stark and immediately noticeable to everyone in the room. As the proceedings began, Michael maintained the same quiet dignity that had served him throughout his military career. He answered questions when directly asked, but offered no additional commentary. He provided facts without editorial explanation. He treated the court with the same respect he had once shown his commanding officers. Judge Brennan, however, interpreted Michael's restraint as disrespect. Each time Michael gave a brief factual answer instead of an elaborate explanation, the judge's frustration grew more visible. When Michael responded to questions about his intentions regarding the tree with simple yes sir or no sir answers, Brennan began tapping his pen impatiently against his desk. The cultural gap between military precision and civilian expectations was widening with each exchange, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither man fully understood was coming. Mrs. Williams took the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed her performance multiple times. She spoke in a clear, emotional voice about the trauma of discovering branches in her swimming pool and the fear she felt every time storm clouds gathered overhead. Her attorney guided her through a detailed account of property damage, complete with color photographs and repair estimates. "Your Honor," Mrs. Williams said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, "I've tried to reason with Mr. Thompson, but he simply refuses to communicate. He just stares at me with this cold, intimidating look whenever I try to discuss the situation. I'm a widow living alone, and his behavior makes me feel unsafe in my own home." Michael's jaw tightened slightly at the mischaracterization, but he remained silent. In his experience, lies exposed themselves given enough time and proper investigation. He trusted the system to reveal the truth through evidence rather than emotion. Judge Brennan leaned forward with interest as Mrs. Williams continued her testimony. She painted a picture of Michael as an uncooperative neighbor who intimidated her through silence and refused to take responsibility for his property. She claimed his military bearing was aggressive and threatening, suggesting that his training had made him unsuitable for civilian life. When it came time for Michael to testify, he stood and walked to the witness stand with the same measured steps he had used to approach the deck of every ship he had ever served on. He placed his right hand on the Bible and repeated the oath in a clear, steady voice. His attorney began with basic questions about the tree's history and Michael's attempts to address Mrs. Williams's concerns. Michael answered each question directly and completely, but without the emotional appeals or elaborate explanations that seemed to characterize civilian testimony. "Mr. Thompson," his attorney asked, "can you describe your efforts to resolve this matter outside of court?" "Yes, sir. I offered to trim branches extending over the property line. I suggested a joint consultation with a certified arborist. I researched local ordinances regarding tree removal and shared that information with Mrs. Williams." "And what was her response to these offers?" "She rejected all proposals and stated that complete tree removal was her only acceptable solution." Judge Brennan interrupted the questioning, his impatience finally boiling over. "Mr. Thompson, this court is interested in more than just facts. We want to understand your reasoning, your feelings about this situation, your plans for resolution. Can you elaborate on your responses?" Michael looked directly at the judge, his military training kicking in automatically. When a superior officer asked for clarification, you provided it clearly and concisely. "Your Honor, I provided complete answers to the questions asked." "The facts speak for themselves." The judge's face reddened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I'm asking you to help this court understand your position. Simply stating facts without context or explanation is not helpful to these proceedings." "Yes, sir. What additional information would you like me to provide?" This response only increased Judge Brennan's frustration. He had grown accustomed to lawyers and witnesses who filled every silence with words, who explained their positions in great detail, and who showed appropriate deference to his authority through elaborate verbal acknowledgments. Michael's military-style communication struck the judge as defiant rather than respectful. The crisp yes sir and no sir responses that had shown proper respect in military settings sounded almost mocking in the civilian courtroom. "Mr. Thompson, are you taking this court seriously? Do you understand the gravity of these proceedings?" "Yes, sir, I understand completely." "Then why are you refusing to properly explain your actions and intentions to this court?" Michael paused, genuinely confused by the question. In his mind, he had been explaining his actions clearly and thoroughly. He had answered every question truthfully and provided all requested information. The suggestion that he was being disrespectful or uncooperative baffled him. "Your Honor, I'm not refusing to explain anything. I've answered all questions asked of me." Judge Brennan slammed his gavel against the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom. "Mr. Thompson, your attitude is unacceptable in my courtroom. You will provide complete, detailed responses to questions, or you will be held in contempt. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a misfired engine. Michael felt the familiar sensation of being misunderstood by people who had never lived by military codes of conduct. In the Navy, efficiency and clarity were valued above all else. Wasting superior officers' time with unnecessary elaboration was considered disrespectful. But here, apparently, the opposite was true. The judge wanted performance rather than precision. He wanted emotional displays rather than factual reporting. He wanted Michael to beg, to plead, to show vulnerability and deference through verbose explanations. Michael's attorney sensed the growing tension and attempted to redirect the questioning toward more concrete issues. Your Honor, perhaps we could focus on the specific allegations regarding property damage and review the evidence Mr. Thompson has gathered about tree maintenance and local regulations. No, Judge Brennan snapped. I want to hear from Mr. Thompson himself. I want him to explain why he thinks his behavior has been appropriate and what he intends to do about this situation. The courtroom fell silent except for the whisper of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic. Outside, Mrs. Williams watched with satisfaction as the judge's frustration with Michael became increasingly obvious. Her attorney smiled slightly, recognizing that the proceedings were going exactly as they had hoped. Michael sat in the witness chair, his back straight and his hands folded calmly in his lap. He understood that he was walking into some kind of trap, but he couldn't identify its exact nature. In combat situations, he had learned to trust his training and stick to proven procedures when facing unknown threats. So he did what he had always done when confronted with hostile questioning from authority figures. He told the truth, clearly and completely without embellishment or emotional manipulation. Your Honor, I have maintained my property according to local ordinances and industry standards. I have attempted to address my neighbor's concerns through reasonable compromise. I have gathered evidence to support my position and am prepared to present it to this court. Judge Brennan's eyes narrowed as he stared at Michael with growing contempt. The attack continued for another 10 minutes, with Judge Brennan delivering what amounted to a public humiliation disguised as judicial procedure. He questioned Michael's intelligence, his social skills, his ability to function in civilian society, and his fitness as a neighbor and community member. Through it all, Michael remained silent except when directly asked questions that required factual responses. Each non-reaction seemed to fuel the judge's anger further, creating a cycle of escalating hostility that filled the courtroom with uncomfortable tension. Mr. Thompson, Judge Brennan said finally, returning to his seat behind the bench, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your military service ended when you took off that uniform. In my courtroom, you are just another citizen who must follow the same rules as everyone else. Your inability to communicate effectively or show appropriate respect suggests that you may not be capable of functioning successfully in civilian society. Michael felt something shift inside him, like the moment when a ship's engines finally overcome the resistance of heavy seas and begin moving at full speed. The judge's words had crossed a line that even hostile enemy interrogators had known better than to cross. Your Honor, Michael said, his voice still calm but now carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. I have served my country honorably for 25 years. I have risked my life to protect the freedoms that allow courts like this to function. I have buried friends who died defending the principles this legal system claims to represent. Judge Brennan's eyes widened slightly at this first sign of pushback, but he pressed forward. Mr. Thompson, your service record is irrelevant to these proceedings. What matters is your behavior in this courtroom and your refusal to take responsibility for your actions as a civilian. With respect, Your Honor, you made my service record relevant when you chose to attack it. Personally, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Williams looked nervous, for the first time since the proceedings began. Her attorney placed a restraining hand on her client's arm, sensing that the situation was moving beyond their control. Michael's public defender started to stand, probably to object or request a recess, but Michael's slight hand gesture stopped him. This was no longer about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. This had become a matter of honor that required a direct response. Your Honor, Michael continued, you have questioned my respect for authority, my ability to function in society, and my fitness as a citizen. You have suggested that my military service was somehow a disqualification, rather than a contribution. I cannot allow these characterizations to stand unchallenged. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his voice becoming dangerous. Mr. Thompson, you are treading on very thin ice. I will not tolerate threats or intimidation in my courtroom. I am making no threats, Your Honor. I am simply stating facts. You have chosen to make this personal, so I will respond personally. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet that comes before thunder. The pause that happens when everyone realizes that something significant is about to change. Michael stood up slowly, his movement precise and controlled. The action wasn't aggressive, but it commanded attention in a way that made everyone in the courtroom focus completely on him. Your Honor, you asked about my military service and my qualifications to participate in civilian society. You questioned my respect for authority and my ability to communicate effectively. You suggested that my training somehow made me unfit for normal human interaction. Judge Brennan started to interrupt, but Michael continued speaking in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom without being raised. For 25 years, I served aboard nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. I held security clearances that required extensive background investigations into every aspect of my character and judgment. I was trusted with equipment worth millions of dollars and information that could affect national security. The judge's face was becoming red again, but now his anger seemed mixed with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first hint that he might have misjudged the situation. I commanded sailors in combat zones and emergency situations. I was responsible for the lives and welfare of men and women under my command. I received commendations for leadership, technical expertise, and performance under pressure. Michael paused, letting his words settle in the quiet courtroom. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. But more importantly, Your Honor, I served with people who gave their lives for the idea that civilian authority should be respected and protected. I watched friends die defending the principle that courts like this should be able to function freely and fairly. Mrs. Williams shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly aware that the proceedings had moved far beyond her property dispute. Her attorney looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. So when you question my respect for legitimate authority, you are questioning the commitment that sustained me through 25 years of service. When you suggest that my training makes me unfit for civilian society, you are insulting not just me, but everyone who serves to protect the freedoms you exercise every day in this courtroom. Judge Brennan opened his mouth to respond, but Michael wasn't finished. I came here today prepared to resolve a simple neighbor dispute through the legal system I spent my career defending. I expected to be treated with the same respect I would show to any civilian authority. Instead, I've been subjected to personal attacks based on prejudices about military service and assumptions about my character. The courtroom was completely silent now, with everyone focused on the quiet man who had finally found his voice. Michael looked directly at Judge Brennan, his posture straight but not threatening, his expression calm but determined. Your Honor, I will not be intimidated or humiliated for the crime of serving my country honorably. I will not apologize for communicating clearly and directly, and I will not allow anyone to suggest that my service was anything other than a privilege and a responsibility that I carried with pride. The words hung in the air like a challenge that demanded a response. The attack continued for another 10 minutes, with Judge Brennan delivering what amounted to a public humiliation, disguised as judicial procedure. He questioned Michael's intelligence, his social skills, his ability to function in civilian society, and his fitness as a neighbor and community member. Through it all, Michael remained silent except when directly asked questions that required factual responses. Each non-reaction seemed to fuel the judge's anger further, creating a cycle of escalating hostility that filled the courtroom with uncomfortable tension. Mr. Thompson, Judge Brennan said finally, returning to his seat behind the bench, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your military service ended when you took off that uniform. In my courtroom, you are just another citizen who must follow the same rules as everyone else. Your inability to communicate effectively or show appropriate respect suggests that you may not be capable of functioning successfully in civilian society. Michael felt something shift inside him, like the moment when a ship's engines finally overcome the resistance of heavy seas and begin moving at full speed. The judge's words had crossed a line that even hostile enemy interrogators had known better than to cross. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice still calm but now carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. "I have served my country honorably for 25 years. I have risked my life to protect the freedoms that allow courts like this to function. I have buried friends who died defending the principles this legal system claims to represent." Judge Brennan's eyes widened slightly at this first sign of pushback, but he pressed forward. "Mr. Thompson, your service record is irrelevant to these proceedings. What matters is your behavior in this courtroom and your refusal to take responsibility for your actions as a civilian. With respect, Your Honor, you made my service record relevant when you chose to attack it." Personally, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Williams looked nervous. For the first time since the proceedings began, her attorney placed a restraining hand on her client's arm, sensing that the situation was moving beyond their control. Michael's public defender started to stand, probably to object or request a recess, but Michael's slight hand gesture stopped him. This was no longer about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. This had become a matter of honor that required a direct response. "Your Honor," Michael continued, "you have questioned my respect for authority, my ability to function in society, and my fitness as a citizen. You have suggested that my military service was somehow a disqualification rather than a contribution. I cannot allow these characterizations to stand unchallenged." Judge Brennan leaned forward, his voice becoming dangerous. "Mr. Thompson, you are treading on very thin ice. I will not tolerate threats or intimidation in my courtroom. I am making no threats, Your Honor. I am simply stating facts. You have chosen to make this personal, so I will respond personally." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet that comes before thunder, the pause that happens when everyone realizes that something significant is about to change. Michael stood up slowly, his movement precise and controlled. The action wasn't aggressive, but it commanded attention in a way that made everyone in the courtroom focus completely on him. "Your Honor, you asked about my military service and my qualifications to participate in civilian society. You questioned my respect for authority and my ability to communicate effectively. You suggested that my training somehow made me unfit for normal human interaction." Judge Brennan started to interrupt, but Michael continued speaking in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom without being raised. "For 25 years, I served aboard nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. I held security clearances that required extensive background investigations into every aspect of my character and judgment. I was trusted with equipment worth millions of dollars and information that could affect national security." The judge's face was becoming red again, but now his anger seemed mixed with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first hint that he might have misjudged the situation. "I commanded sailors in combat zones and emergency situations. I was responsible for the lives and welfare of men and women under my command. I received commendations for leadership, technical expertise, and performance under pressure." Michael paused, letting his words settle in the quiet courtroom. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "But more importantly, Your Honor, I served with people who gave their lives for the idea that civilian authority should be respected and protected. I watched friends die defending the principle that courts like this should be able to function freely and fairly." Mrs. Williams shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly aware that the proceedings had moved far beyond her property dispute. Her attorney looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "So when you question my respect for legitimate authority, you are questioning the commitment that sustained me through 25 years of service. When you suggest that my training makes me unfit for civilian society, you are insulting not just me, but everyone who serves to protect the freedoms you exercise every day in this courtroom." Judge Brennan opened his mouth to respond, but Michael wasn't finished. "I came here today prepared to resolve a simple neighbor dispute through the legal system I spent my career defending. I expected to be treated with the same respect I would show to any civilian authority. Instead, I have been subjected to personal attacks based on prejudices about military service and assumptions about my character." The courtroom was completely silent now, with everyone focused on the quiet man who had finally found his voice. Michael looked directly at Judge Brennan, his posture straight but not threatening, his expression calm but determined. "Your Honor, I will not be intimidated or humiliated for the crime of serving my country honorably. I will not apologize for communicating clearly and directly, and I will not allow anyone to suggest that my service was anything other than a privilege and a responsibility that I carried with pride." The words hung in the air like a challenge that demanded a response. Judge Brennan sat frozen behind his desk, clearly unprepared for Michael's articulate and passionate response. The man he had been trying to humiliate had just delivered one of the most compelling defenses of military service and civilian rights that anyone in the courtroom had ever heard. But instead of backing down or acknowledging his mistake, the judge doubled down on his attack. Pride and embarrassment combined to fuel his anger, making him reckless in a way that would soon prove costly. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice shaking with rage, "your little speech doesn't impress me. I've heard it all before from people like you. You think your military service gives you some kind of moral authority, but what I see is a man who couldn't make it in the real world without someone telling him what to do every minute of every day." The insult landed like a physical blow, but Michael remained standing, his expression unchanged. Around the courtroom, several people looked shocked at the judge's escalating personal attacks. "You talk about sacrifice and service," Judge Brennan continued, "but I wonder what kind of sacrifice it really was. Hiding on some ship in the middle of the ocean while real people dealt with real problems in the real world. Taking orders instead of making hard decisions. Living in a bubble where everything was provided for you, and all you had to do was follow simple instructions." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. The judge was revealing more about his own character with each word, and Michael had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to an enemy's attack was to let them defeat themselves. "And now you come into my courtroom with your rigid posture and your yes or no sir routine, thinking you can intimidate civilian authority with your military bearing. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Thompson. Your service doesn't make you special. It doesn't make you a hero, and it certainly doesn't excuse your complete inability to function as a normal member of society." The courtroom was dead silent, except for the sound of Judge Brennan's heavy breathing. His face was flushed, and sweat had begun to appear on his forehead. He had clearly lost control of both the proceedings and himself. Michael stood quietly for several long seconds, then spoke in a voice that was calm but carried to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, you asked about my service and my qualifications. You questioned my ability to function in civilian society and my respect for authority. I have answered those questions as completely and honestly as I can." He paused, looking directly at the judge with steady eyes. "But there is one thing I haven't mentioned, one qualification that might be relevant to these proceedings." Judge Brennan leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his anger. "And what would that be, Mr. Thompson?" "My call sign, Your Honor." The words were spoken quietly, but they seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. Mrs. Williams looked confused, clearly not understanding the significance of military call signs. Her attorney appeared equally puzzled, but something in Michael's tone made Judge Brennan pause. For the first time since the proceedings began, he looked uncertain. "Your call sign?" he repeated. "Yes, sir. In the Navy, pilots and senior crew members are assigned call signs based on their performance, their character, or significant events in their service. These names become part of their permanent record and follow them throughout their careers." Michael's public defender looked up from his papers with sudden interest, sensing that something important was happening but not sure what it meant. "My call sign," Michael continued, "was given to me after an incident in the Persian Gulf. We were conducting joint operations with an Allied fleet when one of their destroyers suffered a catastrophic engine failure during a storm. The courtroom remained completely silent, with everyone focused on Michael's quiet voice. The ship was taking on water and losing power. Their crew was in immediate danger, and the weather conditions made rescue operations extremely hazardous. Standard procedure called for maintaining safe distance until conditions improved. Judge Brennan found himself leaning forward despite his anger, drawn into the story against his will. "I was serving as operations officer aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln at the time. Our captain was weighing options when I requested permission to attempt a rescue operation using our helicopter squadron." Michael's voice remained calm and factual, but there was something in his tone that commanded absolute attention. "The operation. required flying in 70-knot winds with zero visibility. We had to coordinate multiple aircraft, establish emergency medical facilities, and execute precision rescue maneuvers in conditions that exceeded all safety parameters. The judge's face had gone pale. Something about Michael's matter-of-fact description was more compelling than any dramatic retelling could have been. We successfully evacuated 43 crew members from the disabled vessel. No lives were lost, and the operation was completed without any casualties among the rescue teams. Michael paused, his eyes never leaving Judge Brennan's face. After that incident, I was assigned the call sign, Admiral. Not because of my rank, which at the time was Lieutenant Commander, but because my commanding officers felt that my performance under pressure demonstrated the kind of judgment and leadership they associated with flag-level command. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Mrs. Williams stared at Michael with her mouth slightly open, finally understanding that she had been attacking someone far more significant than she had realized. Throughout the rest of my career, Michael continued, I was known as Admiral Thompson. The name appears on my service records, my commendations, and my retirement documents. It was the name used by officers and enlisted personnel alike, regardless of their rank or position. Judge Brennan's face had turned white. He was beginning to understand that he had just spent the last hour publicly humiliating someone whose service record would stand up to any scrutiny. Michael took one step closer to the bench, his posture respectful but commanding. Your Honor, you questioned my qualifications to participate in civilian society. You suggested that my military service was somehow a disqualification, rather than a contribution. You attacked my character, my intelligence, and my ability to function in the real world. His voice remained calm, but now it carried an authority that filled the entire courtroom. I think it's important that you understand exactly who you have been addressing in this manner. The weight of Michael's revelation settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Judge Brennan sat motionless, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The man he had been ridiculing for the past hour wasn't just any veteran. He was someone whose service record included the kind of heroism that makes headlines and earns presidential commendations. Mrs. Williams looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Her attorney was frantically writing notes, probably calculating how quickly they could withdraw their lawsuit and escape this disaster. Michael remained standing, his posture straight but not aggressive. He had revealed his call sign not to intimidate anyone, but to provide context that the judge had demanded. When someone questions your qualifications and character, you respond with facts. Admiral Thompson, Judge Brennan said quietly, using the call sign for the first time. His voice had lost all of its earlier hostility and now carried a tone of uncertainty. I was not aware of your service record, Your Honor, Michael replied. My service record was never relevant to this proceeding. This is a simple civil matter about a property dispute. My background shouldn't matter any more than Mrs. Williams's background or your own background. The response was gracious, but it only made Judge Brennan's earlier behavior look worse by comparison. Michael was demonstrating the kind of professionalism and restraint that the judge himself should have shown throughout the proceedings. However, Michael continued, when you chose to make my character and qualifications the central issue of this hearing, you made my background relevant. When you suggested that my military service was somehow a disqualification, you opened a door that required a response. Judge Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Around the courtroom, several people were taking notes or whispering quietly to each other. Word of this confrontation would spread quickly through the legal community, and the judge's reputation would suffer significant damage. Mr. Thompson, Admiral Thompson, he said, stumbling over the words. Perhaps we should return to the matter at hand. The property dispute between you and Mrs. Williams. Of course, Your Honor. That's what I've been trying to address all morning. The simple statement highlighted just how far off track the proceedings had gone. What should have been a straightforward hearing about tree damage had become a public humiliation of a respected judge by someone he had tried to bully. Michael's public defender finally found his voice. Your Honor, if I may, I think we should address the evidence regarding the tree and the alleged property damage. My client has documentation that supports his position. Judge Brennan nodded quickly, grateful for any opportunity to move away from the disaster he had created. Yes, of course. Please proceed. But the damage was already done. Mrs. Williams's case had been built on the assumption that Michael was a pushover who could be intimidated through legal pressure. She had counted on presenting herself as a victim of an unreasonable neighbor who refused to communicate or compromise. Instead, the proceedings had revealed Michael to be someone whose character and judgment had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. His calm professionalism under attack had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and restraint that his service record suggested. As the evidence was presented, it became clear that Michael had been telling the truth about everything. The tree in question was healthy and properly maintained. The damage to Mrs. Williams's property had been caused by multiple factors during an unprecedented storm, not by negligence on Michael's part. Professional arborists confirmed that removing the tree would actually increase the risk of property damage by eliminating a natural windbreak that protected both houses. Municipal records showed that Michael had obtained all necessary permits and followed all relevant guidelines for tree maintenance. Most damaging to Mrs. Williams' case were the documented communications between the neighbors. Michael's offers to compromise were all in writing, polite, and reasonable. Mrs. Williams' responses were increasingly hostile and demanding, eventually escalating to threats of legal action unless he completely capitulated to her demands. The evidence painted a clear picture of a reasonable man trying to resolve a dispute with an unreasonable neighbor who had chosen to use the legal system as a weapon of harassment. Judge Brennan listened to the evidence with growing discomfort, realizing that he had publicly humiliated someone who was not only innocent of any wrongdoing, but who had actually gone above and beyond in trying to resolve the situation fairly. When all evidence had been presented, the courtroom fell silent again. Everyone knew what the verdict should be, but the path to that verdict had been so twisted and problematic that no one was sure how to proceed. Michael stood quietly beside his attorney, maintaining the same dignified composure he had shown throughout the ordeal. He had proven his point and defended his honor, but he took no visible satisfaction in Judge Brennan's obvious distress. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier in the day. After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds that the plaintiff has failed to prove negligence on the part of the defendant. The tree in question appears to be properly maintained and poses no unreasonable risk to neighboring properties. Mrs. Williams's face went white as she realized that her expensive legal gamble had failed completely. Furthermore, Judge Brennan continued, the defendant's efforts to resolve this matter outside of court appear to have been both reasonable and generous. This court sees no basis for the requested damages or injunctive relief. The formal language of the verdict couldn't hide the judge's discomfort with the entire situation. He had been forced to rule in favor of someone he had spent an hour trying to humiliate, and everyone in the courtroom understood the irony. But Michael's vindication was only the beginning of the consequences that would flow from this morning's events. The courtroom began to empty as people filed out, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of excitement and speculation. Mrs. Williams left quickly with her attorney, avoiding eye contact with Michael, and clearly eager to escape the scene of their humiliating defeat. Michael remained seated at the defendant's table, organizing his papers with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the proceedings. His public defender, James Martinez, sat beside him in stunned silence, still processing what he had witnessed. Admiral, Martinez said quietly, why didn't you tell me about your service record? About your call sign? Michael looked up from his papers, his expression thoughtful. Because it wasn't relevant to the case. This was about a tree and property damage, not about military service. I only brought it up when the judge made it necessary. But if I had known, I could have prepared differently. I could have presented your background to establish credibility. Mr. Martinez, Michael said gently, the facts of the case should have been enough. My service record doesn't make me more truthful or more deserving of fair treatment than any other citizen. Everyone who comes into this courtroom deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their background. The young lawyer nodded slowly, beginning to understand the lesson he had just witnessed. Michael's response to the judge's attacks hadn't been about claiming special privileges because of his military service. It had been about demanding the basic respect that every citizen deserves in a court of law. Judge Brennan remained on the bench long after the courtroom had emptied, staring at his hands and contemplating the disaster he had created. His clerk approached cautiously, unsure whether to interrupt his thoughts. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "there are reporters outside asking for comments about the proceedings." The judge's head snapped up, his face going pale. Word had already begun to spread about the confrontation between a respected judge and a decorated veteran. By evening, the story would be circulating through legal circles and veteran organizations across the state. "No comments," he said quickly. "I have no comments about any ongoing proceedings." But it was too late for damage control. Several people in the courtroom had been recording video on their phones, and clips of Michael's quiet but powerful defense of military service were already being shared on social media. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. "Judge attacks veteran in courtroom" became the headline that would define Judge Brennan's career and reputation. Legal experts and veteran advocates lined up to provide commentary about judicial conduct and the treatment of military personnel in civilian courts. Michael drove home in silence, his mind processing the morning's events. He had won the case, but the victory felt hollow. He had never wanted a confrontation with Judge Brennan. He had simply wanted to resolve a neighbor dispute through the proper legal channels. The irony wasn't lost on him. By trying to humiliate someone he perceived as weak and vulnerable, Judge Brennan had instead created a public relations disaster that would follow him for the rest of his career. Over the following weeks, the story continued to grow. Video clips of Michael's testimony went viral, particularly his calm explanation of how he had earned his call sign. Veterans organizations used the incident as an example of the challenges military personnel face when transitioning to civilian life. Judge Brennan faced formal complaints from the State Bar Association and calls for his resignation from veteran advocacy groups. His attempt to intimidate a quiet veteran had backfired spectacularly, turning him into a symbol of judicial misconduct and prejudice against military service. Mrs. Williams found herself dealing with unexpected consequences as well. Her neighbors, many of whom were veterans or military families, learned about her role in the courtroom drama. Property values in the neighborhood began to decline as the story attracted negative attention to the area. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the change in how the legal community viewed interactions with veteran litigants. Michael's case became a cautionary tale taught in judicial ethics courses, demonstrating how unconscious bias and assumptions about military culture could lead to serious professional and ethical problems. Michael returned to his quiet life, tending his garden and maintaining the old oak tree that had started the whole controversy. He received hundreds of letters from veterans thanking him for his dignified response to Judge Brennan's attacks. Many shared their own stories of feeling misunderstood or unwelcome in civilian institutions. He never sought publicity or tried to capitalize on his unexpected fame. When reporters called asking for interviews, he politely declined. When veteran organizations invited him to speak at events, he respectfully suggested that they focus on veterans who needed help with housing, health care, or employment, rather than someone who had simply stood up for himself in court. The oak tree continued to stand in his backyard, its roots deep in soil that had nourished it for over a century. Like Michael himself, it had weathered storms that would have broken lesser specimens. Its branches provided shade and shelter, asking nothing in return except the chance to grow peacefully in the place it had chosen to call home. Judge Brennan eventually resigned from the bench under pressure, his career destroyed by a single morning's poor judgment. He never publicly apologized to Michael, though he did issue a statement acknowledging that his behavior had fallen short of judicial standards. Michael never spoke publicly about the judge's resignation or the broader consequences of their courtroom confrontation. When asked by friends about his feelings regarding Brennan's downfall, he simply said that he hoped everyone involved could learn something positive from the experience. In the end, the case became a reminder that respect and dignity are not earned through titles or positions, but through character and actions. Michael's quiet strength had revealed more about true leadership than any dramatic speech or aggressive display could have accomplished. He continued to serve his community in small, quiet ways, volunteering at veteran support organizations and helping younger veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. His call sign, Admiral, became known not just for the heroic rescue that had earned it, but for the grace and dignity he had shown when facing an attack on his character and service. The story of the silent veteran who found his voice in a hostile courtroom became legend in military circles, passed down as an example of how to maintain honor and integrity even when facing overwhelming odds. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is simply standing firm in your principles and speaking the truth with quiet confidence.